Great news, everyone. Blizzard are removing a whole ton of Mythic Plus affixes going into the War Within. The bad news, though, is they're keeping the worst ones, and they've added another bunch as well. So yes, yet another expansion cycle in which sanguine and bolstering will make Mythic Plus a fun time. So here's what went down. Blizzard announced a whole wave of changes to dungeons for the War Within. Now, the good news is most of it was them saying that the Season 4 difficulty changes, which I think have been very good, are continuing, but there are some nice tweaks. Mythic Zeros will be on a daily lockout, and they'll be the seasonal dungeons, not the all-new, 8 that come with the expansion, and they'll be open on Season 1 launch, September 10th. But then the heroic dungeons will be the 8 new War Within dungeons until Season 1, and then when Season 1 begins, those will swap over to being the seasonal ones, which is all well and good, actually excellent changes. But then things got weird because Blizzard started talking about today's sponsor. Our friends over at boot.dev/Bellular, who will teach you back-end web development, which is an amazing skill using Python and Go, which are amazing technologies, and the smart way by making it fun. They're an online self-paced platform 100% designed to get you writing code, and not just any code. You're working through role-playing game-inspired problems, and when you go to boot.dev/Bellular, you'll see that it itself has got quests, levels, XP achievements, even boss fights, and you can get 25% off your first purchase with my link and code. Now, when I look at something like Boot, what I always want to see is them working hard on new content. So here's their June update. Have you ever heard of Git? Well, it's very important, and their new module, Learn Git, does just that. It's got 12 hours of content across 66 lessons and quizzes. They've shipped it this month, and now they're cooking up Chapter 2 of Git. They're also doing memory management using C, which gives me very big university nostalgia. They're doing boss fights, lore, podcasts, and their Discord community to all keep the platform growing and fun. I've never seen such a good setup for learning these practical and job-focused skills, so you can hit them up at boot.dev/Bellular. Code Bellular gets you 25% off your first purchase, and that's backed by their no questions asked 30-day money-back guarantee, and they've got free demos of all their courses that you can just go and browse first. So, boot.dev/Bellular. Thanks to them, and let's go. First things first, they are changing the affix breakpoints. Season 4 had affixes kick in at 2, 5, and 10, but now they'll be kicking in at 2, 4, and 7. But with a pretty big difference. The middle bracket, which had Storming, Volcanic, Incorporeal, Afflicted, and Entangled, is being entirely replaced, and the last bracket is the same, except for losing Spiteful. So, Sanguine, Bolstering, Raging, and Bursting will be appearing in Mythic Plus a whole 3 levels earlier. Lovely. They've also changed crests, where basically you will need +9s for aspect crests, and I think that's basically Blizzard trying to hit parity between Mythic Plus and Raid, which ultimately I think is fair enough. But let's talk about the new affixes then. So this replaces the middle bracket, and they're interesting. They are entirely different, and while there are going to be problems here, some of the developer intent is actually moving in a positive direction. So the new affixes are Reckless, Thorned, Attuned, and Focused. And what's interesting is their Kiss curse effects. They have positives and they have negatives. I hope you're sitting down. I hope you're ready. I hope you have taken your Vicodin because it is time for the incredible reveal. Reckless will make non-boss enemies without mana ignore 20% of armor, but themselves will have 30% reduced armor and take 10% extra arcane damage. Thorned then will make non-boss enemies without mana do physical damage to attackers, but themselves take 10% increased holy and shadow damage. Attuned then is non-boss enemies with mana this time, so it will impact the casters, and pretty crazy, they'll do 20% increased magic damage, but they will take 10% extra nature and 30% extra bleed damage. Focus then gives non-boss enemies with mana 30% haste, ouch, but they will take 10% increased fire and frost damage. Easy to understand, right? You know, there's a skit in old Star Trek about a game called Fizbin. If you know, then you know, and this reminds me of that. Anyway, before we dig in, let's see what Blizzard have got to say about this themselves. They say they aim to shift the source of challenge to the dungeon and the mobs with more simple affixes. They say they want to reduce noise, nameplate clutter, and the amount of things that players have got to deal with, and will allow for, quote, varied and context-specific gameplay decisions. They basically claim that these effects are an advantage without being essential, and it will give good opportunities to flex on talents, gear, and consumables. So basically, right, they're kind of saying that most people can just ignore this stuff if they want, and while they're ignoring it, it's not like there's just going to be, you know, a bunch of swirlies, a bunch of, nameplate clutter. No, it'll just be, there's some damage stuff, whatever, deal with it, but you don't need to pay attention. That at least is something that I can kind of get behind. It is these affixes basically not mattering as much in terms of, like, the quite nuts and bolts gameplay. That being said, though, it's WoW. Numbers do matter. So, is all of that stuff, is all the justification just Blizzard cope, or are they onto something? Well, Mythic Plus players, at least the vocal ones, do think this is a little misguided. Tattles in his video says that a week of bonus damage just makes the other weeks feel worse for some players, and of course that mobs with or without mana, that being a specification will just likely be a bit complicated and weird. Quite a few people across Twitter are also highlighting other pretty obvious issues, like the affixes being a curse for tanks and healers, and then a kiss for DPS players, so only some people get to benefit. DPS players are still the absolute all-star champions, and of course, well, tanks are leaders while healers are just, we're just there to be abused, I guess. Anyway, Mythic Plus is already, of course, struggling with tanks basically being overloaded with all of the, all the things they've got to do as tanks, also basically being de facto group leaders. And then with healers, basically, we're either stressed and about to have a heart attack because of ping-ponging health bars, or we just feel completely pointless, and there's not that much in between. Reckless, as an example, which gives Armor Pen, that will just be extra reliable tank damage. Thorned, which is the spell reflect, that kind of spooked people. Because, people are kind of thinking, oh, what if I crit on a thorned enemy? Will I just die? It's probably not that. It's almost certainly just some slow rot damage that healers will have to touch up, right? Then with attuned and focused, well, those make caster mobs a bit more dangerous, and that could kind of mean there'll be some nightmare weeks, again, depending on the dungeons. There's already a very heavy reliance on Vengeance Demon Hunters because of Sigil of Silence and the magic damage reduction, and those two affixes, of course, are just going to push that even further. Then, focused 30% haste and casters, that is going to put emphasis on interrupting and CCing things a little bit better, but if the DPS and the tank fail that, of course, who's got to deal with the problems? The healer does. And that is going to result, worst case, in people just spamming healer wake up into chat, as I'm sure we're all so used to getting. Attune's 20% extra magic damage will also then turn a lot of near-miss targeted spellcasts into one-shots on DPS. That could be rough. They could also have an impact on how you're spending your interrupts. I mean, it really does seem like a lot of extra pain just so you get some extra nature and bleed damage, which doesn't seem worth it. So, the kiss. Well, it's only a kiss, it's only a buff, a benefit for certain specs each week. And that is clearly, I think, Blizzard trying to add some class variation into the affix rotation to try and, shake things up. But to be honest, that does feel ham-fisted, right? I mean, every other week not being your week, to some people could suck. Like, say, if you're a Shadow Priest, and the only one that feels great is Thorned Week, or you're an Arcane Mage, and, well, you only feel great during Reckless, while many other specs will just get to double dip. That being said, also who the hell knows how well balanced specs will be. It could actually be that the buffs from these will be utterly irrelevant as compared to the natural variation between specs. Again, a lot of stuff is just going to depend on how well Blizzard are able to balance the expansion. Yeah, there's very much going to be a type chart of, who gets bonuses from what week. Here's actually a fun and very rough one that we put together just to loosely illustrate it. Now, the Kiss particularly makes Arcane Mages, all Priests, and Athlocks look pretty damn bad, since they'll only benefit from 1 week, whereas it's a very passionate Kiss if you're a Havoc, Demon Hunter, or you're a Destro Warlock, because they do a substantial amount of chaos damage, which, will benefit from all schools, and will even double dip up to 20% on the 2 weeks with 2 magic buffs. So, yeah, great. They're all buffed. And then surprisingly, Hunters do actually fare quite well with their damage spread, so I guess that's some good news. But you can see the problem here, right? Thorned Week basically just cuts the buff DPS specs down to Unholy, Ret, and Shadow, and of course the two special children, the Teacher's Pet, the DH, and the Destro Lock. Now, of course, this will only apply to a subset of mobs, and that will stop these affixes from being too important overall. Remember, these are not applied to like every single mob in the dungeon, they're only applied to non-boss mobs with or without a mana bar. So that is actually pretty damn impactful. Like, there's a lot of detail, a lot of stuff that we can like latch our brains onto, but you gotta remember these are not going to be every single mob, and they're also not going to be on bosses. Still though, we know that with the meta, people will find any reason to say that some specs can't come, right? I mean, you know what it's like when you're trying to pug, it can suck. And I suppose also this just feels really quite arbitrary. I mean, they really just want to say melee and caster mobs, but the only way they can explain that in terms of game mechanics is, do they have a mana bar or not have a mana bar? I mean, that's weird, and needing to know if a mob has a mana bar has not been an important thing in a long ass time. I mean, the easy solution there is to throw a buff on them, and of course if Blizzard don't do that, then a weak aura will, and everybody will just use that. And it all begs the question, is it really necessary? Because this is basically 2 weeks of dangerous melee, and 2 weeks of dangerous casters, but where that could get spicy is Fortified Week. Imagine Fortified Week, your casters are more dangerous, and they've got a load of haste. Yeah, that could be quite something. I mean, these are not terrible affixes, and they will accomplish some of Blizzard's stated goals, but I think there will be a cost, and I really hope they factor that cost in. And really, all it does is just shuffle around some class variety, but in an awkward way, and then it also makes a Demon Hunter a permanent fixture in every group, and it can make things a bit more difficult for non-DPS people. And of course, in World of Warcraft, we have DPS for days. There's the damage dealers hanging from the rafters. The thing that we actually need more of is tanks and healers. I mean, hell, even the affixes that they decided to keep sort of follow that unstated philosophy. People absolutely hate sanguine bursting and bolstering. They are run killers, and they're always a tank and healer problem. I mean, if you want to move complexity into the dungeon and away from the affix, I mean, remove the nightmare of people needing to pull small, split DPS, or just mess around with unhinged positioning that ends up just causing trouble in pugs. I mean, the loss of Incorporeal and Afflicted and some of the other changes, those make sense, and those actually will help make the dungeon itself matter more, but again, to DPS. They've very clearly removed the affixes that made the DPS players have to do something except parse with their damage buttons. So why did they get a free pass, but tanks and healers are still having to just play the affix as well as the game? I can't really think of a good answer. If you can though, definitely do let us all know. Clearly then, the reliance on using class utility to solve affixes just hasn't really panned out how they would like, because that was kind of the past intent. This is the replacement for bring the class, not the player, but it does feel like a defensive play. Like they're afraid of a god comp showing up and dominating the meta, so they're just going to tweak around the numbers on a week-to-week basis to make sure that it can't be one god comp all the time. I suppose it just feels like it offers no real benefit, but it does offer the opportunity for, as an example, overlaps with Fortify to just cause problems. I don't want to say just balance the game, but man, at some point, surely the answer is really to just simplify and balance instead of constantly having to jump through hoops. So combine this clearly, messy, sort of unclear philosophy with the fact that these changes are a total surprise to everyone. They again said not to expect any ethics things in interviews, and it is a bit of a mind-boggling, weird situation. But again, it does represent a shift in philosophy that I do like, because what are they talking about? They are talking about the dungeon mattering more, the affixes mattering less nameplate clutter, less mechanical clutter, less incorporeal dudes just appearing in places. Like that, I am totally all for. It just doesn't seem that these particular new affixes have hit the mark, even if perhaps the philosophy itself does have legs. Now, this is not the end of the world. In no way is it, but compared to the War Within's generally well-considered incisive changes across basically the entirety of the game, this feels undercooked, if not just straight up raw. So I suppose here's to hoping they can take the feedback and they can work out something good here before the game launches, which is in, by the way, just over 2 months' time. Because, as it stands, Mythic Plus will still suffer from, well, only insane people wanting to tank or heal in a pug, and certain classes and specs being black sheep depending on what week it is, which doesn't feel great. Anyway, that's the community reaction. our reaction, and now you also know what the changes are. Who knows, maybe we'll see these tested on Thursday, and we'll find out the actual damage difference is negligible, and we'll all just realize that this is all kind of ignorable. Maybe. But we will report in and let you know as soon as we have the information. Hope you enjoyed today's video. Do let me know what you think about these topics. Of course, thanks to today's sponsor for supporting our team. And if you want to get caught up on just what the hell is happening, check out what we published yesterday.